Hey everybody, it's Roger, creator of the Azure Sandbox, and in this video we're going to go over the architecture and the getting started components of the Azure SQL Database configuration in the Azure Sandbox. So we're going to go up to our handy dandy vanity URL. And that will take us to the Azure Sandbox guide in the Azure Architecture Center. And we're going to use that to navigate over to our GitHub repository, which is at Azure, github.com, Azure-samples/Azure Sandbox. And the configuration that we're working with is this one, Terraform Azure RM MS SQL. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture of this configuration. So this configuration really just includes, it's pretty simple. It just includes a few different components. Primarily, it includes an Azure SQL Database logical server and an Azure SQL Database test database. And then we expose connectivity to that logical server using a private endpoint that we can get because Azure SQL Database supports the private link service. So we drop that endpoint for Azure SQL Database in the same subnet that we do for the private endpoint for Azure Storage, because we can use the same subnet for any private link, private endpoints. So different Azure services support different connectivity models associated with that. So the other thing that we do in this is we wire together the DNS for that private endpoint so that we can connect using the private endpoint and we can have DNS queries resolve correctly. So that's a very useful part of this configuration if you're trying to figure out how not only private endpoints to Azure SQL Database work, but also the DNS and the private DNS zone configuration for that connectivity. So, well, let's talk about the dependent configurations. You cannot provision this configuration without first provisioning VNet app. So VNet app is required to provision this. And in order to provision VNet app, you must also have provisioned VNet shared. So there are actually two different configurations that must be provisioned in advance in order to do this. So in the next video, we'll pick up with this getting started section. Thank you.